Canada, the Great North, a place seen by many as the friendly upstairs neighbor to the United States. Like any other developed country, they have laws and police officers who are there to uphold those laws. If you cause trouble, you could be picked up and taken to jail in order to keep the community safe. It may just be to a drunk tank where you can sober up and be released in the morning, something as much about protecting you than the people around you. Sometimes, though, the police decide to put you in more danger than you were in to begin with. This is Monsters. Neil Stonechild wasn't necessarily a bad kid. He was more of a wild child. At 17 years old, he had had his fair share of run-ins with the law. Drinking, vandalism, and petty theft had eventually landed the teen in a community home for 6 months while he also completed community service. His mother, Stella Stonechild, had been hoping her son was straightening his life out as he was showing promise by following the rules set upon him by the community home. That was until he ran away. On November 13, 1990, he had left the home without permission and now he was wanted by the police. He spent a few weeks hanging out with his friends, and when Stella told him he would get a less severe punishment if he returned to the community home on his own instead of being caught by the police, he told her he would go back on Sunday the 25th. It was Friday, and he just wanted a couple more days to hang out before he was locked up again. He didn't know it would be his last weekend alive. Neil Stonechild was born on August 24, 1973, while Stella was living in Thompson, Manitoba. Thompson is in the northern region of the province and is the setting of the current CBC television drama SkyMed. The area is small, remote, and very cold. Stella had found that she turned to alcohol anytime she had a problem, and she had no support system there to help break that cycle. At the time, she was dating a man named Norman Bignell, and she told him that she wanted to move to Saskatoon where she had family and that he could join her, but he also had to quit drinking. He agreed, and the two adults plus Stella's 4 children packed their bags and headed south. Now, on a global scale, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan wouldn't be considered southern, but compared to Thompson, Stella described it as downright balmy. She was able to successfully put her drinking habit behind her, and after a few relapses, Norman did the same. In Saskatoon, the kids did well. The oldest was Erica, 4 years older than Neil, and then Marcel, who was 2 years older. Neil was the third child, and his younger brother, Jake, was 2 years younger. They followed the rules, and Neil joined the wrestling team when he was 14. The kids' peers weren't so obedient, and eventually the Stonechilds were getting into trouble. Erica and Marcel were able to break free and become responsible adults, but Neil seemed stuck in a pattern of petty crime and brief stints in either a juvenile detention center or the community home. On Saturday, November 24, 1990, Neil hung out with friends in town and they planned to have a party that evening. They scraped together what money they could and talked Neil's older brother Marcel into buying them vodka. Before he went off to drink and play cards with his friends, Neil called Pat Picard, the woman who ran the community home, and told her he would turn himself in the next day. Later that evening, when the vodka bottle was empty, Neil decided he wanted to go out and look for his ex-girlfriend Lucille. It had been years since Neil and Lucille dated, and their parents made them break up because they were in fact second cousins, but Neil was still hung up on her. He had seen her earlier that day on the bus and invited her to the party, but she turned him down. She said she was going to hang out with her sister, and Neil knew where her sister lived, so he enlisted his friend Jason Roy to go out into the cold and track her down. Jason was reluctant, but he eventually agreed and the two left the party. The Snowberry Downs apartment complex wasn't far from the party, but the temperature outside was in the negatives and the two teens didn't really dress for the cold. Jeans, t-shirt, and tennis shoes were the common uniform. Neil wore a flannel and a bomber jacket, but never wore gloves. He was also never seen without a white baseball cap on his head, but that did nothing to insulate from the cold. Neil was dressed for a winter in California, not Saskatoon. It wasn't a big deal to him because he wasn't ever outside for long. The party was at a house a few blocks away from his own. It was a 10-minute walk from the party to the apartment, and that included a stop at a 7-Eleven convenience store to warm up. Neither of the boys had any money, so they slipped to the back of the store and sneaked soda from behind a rack of potato chips. While horsing around, they knocked some products from a shelf and the clerk threatened to call the police. Neil and Jason fled the store and ran to the apartment complex to start looking for Lucille. Despite Neil's efforts to hide his face, the clerk recognized him and reported him to the police, who were already looking for him due to his unauthorized absence from the community home. At Snowberry Downs, Neil didn't know which apartment Lucille's sister lived in, so they checked the residence list but didn't see any names they recognized. After that, they started going around the apartment doors and knocking just to ask anyone who answered if Lucille was there. When they finally found the correct unit, Neil tried to get Lucille to come to the door, but she wouldn't. She was there, but she didn't want to talk to him, and she suggested her sister's boyfriend call the police. It's unclear when Neil and Jason separated, but eventually Jason was tired of being cold and started walking back to the party. It seems that Neil had stayed at the apartment and continued harassing the occupants until he heard them call the police. Constable Brad Senger was a rookie with the Saskatoon Police Service and was riding with veteran Constable Larry Hartwig. They received a call that Neil had been at the 7-Eleven, and while patrolling the streets looking for him, they got a second call that he was at the Snowberry Downs apartment, so they headed there. They logged that they were en route at 11:51 p.m., and it seems as though they found Neil and placed him in the back of their patrol car. It's unknown what happened between the time that Neil was taken into custody and when he was next seen. Jason was walking back to the party when the police cruiser pulled in front of him and stopped. Jason could see Neil in the back seat, blood on his face, and Neil yelled out that the cops were going to kill him. One of the constables asked him if he knew their passenger. Jason denied knowing Neil and gave the constables a fake name, which he knew would come back clean. His ruse worked and the cruiser drove away. The problem with Jason's sighting of Neil only minutes after the officers responded to the call at Snowberry Downs is that the officers cleared the call by claiming that Neil was already gone by the time they had gotten there. Jason returned to the house where the party had taken place and went into the basement where kids regularly crashed. He found his girlfriend, told her that Neil had been picked up by the cops, and went to sleep. The following day, Stella was frustrated that her son had disappeared again, breaking his promise to return to the community home. Still, it was possible that he had been picked up by the police before he could return on his own, so she called the Saskatoon Police Service and inquired about the status of her son. The desk officer told her that a patrol car had been sent to pick him up, and she transferred Stella to holding. The officer there said that Neil Stonechild had never been booked in the previous 24 hours. Stella hung up, assuming the teen had run off to the reservation, but as days passed, neither she nor Neil's siblings could shake the feeling that something was wrong. On November 29th, two men were building a fence on property near the Hitachi manufacturing plant in northern Saskatoon. As they worked, they noticed a body laying in the snow-covered field to their north. When authorities arrived on the scene, they noticed that the body was missing one shoe and had the sleeves of their jacket pulled down over their hands. It was an understandable attempt to keep themselves warm, as the night of November 24th had gotten down to negative 28 degrees Celsius or negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Footprints led to a gravel parking lot a block over. The coroner examined the body on site and said there were no signs of foul play, despite there being injuries to the victim's face. He also said that he believed that the body had been there for several days. The coroner also didn't make any notes of his preliminary examination. A police dog was used to search the field, but no investigation of the gravel lot was conducted. The police determined that the victim had stumbled into the field, probably drunk, fell forward, injuring their face, and died of exposure. The questions of why the young man was in that field in an industrial area or how he had gotten there seemed irrelevant to the authorities. They looked around for his missing shoe, but quickly shrugged it off. After being taken to the morgue, officers used information on the body to identify him as 17-year-old Neil Stonechild. Stella hadn't realized that Neil had died even when the news of the body in the field was reported. Her son had been radio silent for almost a week, so she was initially interested when she heard that a body had been found frozen in a field. She watched the story on the television, but the coroner had estimated the victim to have been about 30, so when the reporter relayed that detail, Stella believed it couldn't have been Neil and went back to her daily routine. Besides, why would Neil be way out there and how would he have gotten there? It was later the same day that a police officer arrived at her house and asked to speak to her about her son. She thought he must have been arrested, but was soon informed that it was in fact Neil in that field. Despite the scene officers suggesting it was a drunken accident, it was still a sudden death and was referred to the morality unit, which was like a catch-all unit to investigate crimes that weren't homicides. They took cases of sudden death which tended to be suspicious but weren't known to positively be murder. Sergeant Keith Jarvis was assigned to the case and he went to the community home to talk to Pat Picard. She gave him some contact information for the most likely friends who would have been the last to see the teen. Then the sergeant typed up a report and went home, assuming the autopsy wouldn't happen for a few days since the body needed to thaw. The autopsy was completed the following day by a doctor who continually referred to the victim as Leo instead of Neil. He noted multiple abrasions on the face, noting that they likely bled but that they were unlikely to have caused death. He listed the cause of death as hypothermia. The autopsy was complete when Sergeant Jarvis returned to work that afternoon, though he was never informed, so he hadn't been able to attend. Jarvis began contacting the people from the list he had been given the day before, but it was Jason who ended up contacting the sergeant after seeing the news that the body had been identified as Neil. He met with Jarvis and told him about the evening that Neil went missing. He explained their activities earlier in the day and then about going to Snowberry Downs and knocking on doors. He said that, after they split up, a police cruiser with Neil in the back seat stopped and asked him if he knew Neil. He said no because he believed that he would also be arrested if he said yes. He gave them his cousin's name and they let him go. At the end of the day, Sergeant Jarvis wrote a report that did not include any of the details Jason had told him and concluded that Neil had walked out to the area because it was near the correctional center and he was intending to turn himself in. He posited that the teen fell down drunk, passed out, and died of hypothermia. The problem was that Pat Picard had never told Jarvis that Neil was intending to turn himself in, and it was never known where the sergeant got that information. Still, Pat explained that he would have turned himself in to her. The correctional center was an adult facility and would not have accepted Neil as an inmate, so he had no reason to go there. He could have turned himself in to Kilburn Youth Detention Center, but that was the opposite direction from Snowberry Downs than the correctional center. It was also just over 8 kilometers or 5 miles from Snowberry Downs to the field where his body was found. That would be a 2-hour walk in good conditions, but it was windy with sub-zero temperatures and it was unlikely he would have made it that far before succumbing to the cold. It was after midnight and there was no public transportation available. Neil getting to that area on his own was extremely unlikely. Sergeant Jarvis suggested the case be looked at by Major Crimes while he was away for 4 days, but by the time he returned, nobody had touched the file. He shrugged it off and closed the case. He called Stella on December 6th, telling her that the case was closed and that her son had walked north, passed out, and froze to death. Stella knew that was not the truth. The community was aware that police officers would take natives they picked up during nuisance calls to the outskirts of town and make them walk back as a form of punishment. Sometimes they did it to native kids just for the hell of it. It had happened to Jake twice when he was only 11. They became known as Starlight Tours. Stella knew that Neil was the victim of something like that, but there was no way she was going to be able to convince the police to listen to her. Unfortunately, her cries for help were ignored, which meant the Starlight Tours in Saskatoon continued. On January 29, 2000, a man's frozen body was found near a feed store in the south end of Saskatoon. The man was wearing only sweatpants and tennis shoes, and he had identification in his pocket that said he was 25-year-old Rodney Nastis. His shirt and jacket were found nearby, likely taken off by himself. When a person suffers from hypothermia, they can experience what is called paradoxical undressing. The brain starts telling the body that it's really hot, making the victim take their clothes off, which in turn makes them die faster. Like Neil Stonechild, the investigators brushed the death off as another drunk man stumbling around at night before passing out and freezing to death. But soon another body was discovered in the same area. On February 3rd, 2 technicians who worked for the nearby rail yard discovered a frozen body in a nearby field. When officers arrived on the scene, they identified an adult male who was wearing jeans, a white t-shirt, and only socks with no shoes. He was laying face down and was frozen to the ground. They were able to pull his wallet out of his back pocket, where they learned that he was 30-year-old Lawrence Wegner. They didn't just look in his wallet, though. They tossed the wallet to one of the workers who had found the body, and that man looked for the owner's identification. Then more officers arrived and proceeded to trample all over the scene without any concern to protect evidence. When investigator Bob Peters arrived, he wasn't happy about the condition of the scene, and a witness said he let the scene officer in charge know it. Because the body was frozen solid to the ground, the police tarped off the area around the body and set up heaters to help melt the ice. Before the ice had thawed enough to turn the body, they were able to lift his shirt where they saw a bruise in the shape of a boot tread on his back. When they were finally able to roll him over, they found another bruise on his face. The investigation into this most recent frozen victim was barely even started before a chance encounter would bring a horrifying story to the attention of the authorities. Daryl Knight was a big man who was a regular patron at the local bars in Saskatoon. On the evening of January 28, 2000, he had been bar hopping with some friends, but after the bars closed, they headed to a house party. He had been in his fair share of brawls, but when a fight broke out at the party, Daryl didn't want to have anything to do with it. As he headed to the door, he heard a woman calling the police and knew the party was definitely over. He left the house and was about to walk across the park to crash at his sister's house when he saw a patrol car pull up. Officers in the area had been called to a different emergency, and Daryl must have assumed they were answering the call about the fight. So when they just continued past the house, he banged his fist on the back of the car. Constable Dan Hatchin and Constable Ken Munson were in the vehicle, and when they heard the man strike the car, they stopped. Hatchin got out of the passenger seat and approached Daryl. Daryl yelled at him to do his job and go stop the guys who were fighting. That's when Munson also got out of the car and informed Daryl he was under arrest. Daryl assumed he would be spending the night in the drunk tank, but the 2 constables had other plans. Daryl hadn't seemed to realize anything was wrong when neither of the constables asked him his name or entered anything into the computer in the cruiser. The cruiser drove out to the city limit just past the Queen Elizabeth Power Station and stopped. The constables let Daryl out of the back seat and removed his cuffs. Daryl tried his best to get as many identifying details as he could. He saw that they were driving cruiser number 57, and he tried to remember one of the constables' names, but it seemed he got them mixed up. Instead of Hatchin or Munson, he recalled one of them being named Hansen. The constables got back in the car and drove away. Daryl was not planning to be outside for long periods of time. He and his friends had taken cabs between destinations, and his walk to his sister's house would have been short, so he was only in jeans, a shirt, and a denim jacket. Daryl was able to walk the 2 kilometers or 1.2 miles to the power station where he banged on the door. There was someone inside the power station 24 hours a day, but at the time, Mark Evoy had gone to the 2nd floor to do paperwork and couldn't hear Daryl. Daryl went around to the back of the building and banged on more doors, but didn't get an answer. By the time he got back around to the front, he banged on the door again, and Mark had just come back into the reception area. Of course, it was about 6 in the morning, and the employee was apprehensive about letting the stranger in, but after Daryl begged, claiming he was going to freeze to death, Mark relented. Inside, the freezing man explained what had happened and asked if Mark could call him a cab. Though Mark found the man's story unlikely, he agreed to call him a cab, and soon Daryl was picked up and on his way to his sister's house. He was angry at the time and vowed to report the constables, but by the next morning he had come to his senses. Native residents did not fare well with the police, and it was safer for him to not make any enemies in the police service. Only 5 days later, on February 3rd, Daryl was riding in the car with his uncle and cousin when they were pulled over. It turned out that his young cousin had gotten himself unbuckled, and Constable Bruce Ebel was able to see that he wasn't properly secured. As the constable walked back to his vehicle to write up a ticket, a news report came on the radio. Daryl listened as it was reported that a body had been frozen near the Queen Elizabeth power station. Daryl had told his uncle about what had happened, and so when the constable returned to the car, he asked him what he knew about the body. Constable Eholt said he didn't know much, and sensing something was going on, he asked why the men were interested. That's when Daryl told the story of what had happened to him in the exact same area. His Starlight Tour happened the night before Rodney Nastis's body was found, also in the same area. Constable Eholt asked Daryl to give him some time to look into his story. Then he took the ticket back and tore it up. The following day, Constable Eholt picked up Daryl and took him to the police station to make a formal statement. People were taking his claim seriously, but the problem was that he told them that the constables were in car 57 when they were actually in car 27. He was looking at the numbers upside down and confused the 2 with a 5. But there was a car 57, and the constables that had been assigned to that vehicle on January 28th were sent home while an investigation was conducted. Constables Hatchin and Munson couldn't let 2 innocent colleagues take the fall for what they had done, so they confessed to having been the ones who had taken Daryl Knight on a Starlight Tour. Once news got out that someone had come forward to accuse officers of taking him out to the edge of the city and making him walk back, and that 2 constables had confessed to having done it, people started calling reporters and telling their stories. Many of them had been taken on a Starlight Tour in warmer months, but now that it was happening during the winter and people were dying, other victims felt that enough was enough. Tensions between the native population and the police were already thick, but they were reaching a boiling point and only going to get worse. Don Worm was Jason Roy's uncle and one of the first Aboriginal lawyers in the country. Jason had told Don about seeing Neil Stonechild in the back of the police cruiser on the night that he had died, but at the time, Don only warned his nephew to be careful about making accusations against the police. 10 years later, Daryl Knight entered the lawyer's office and told him about being left out by the power station, near where 2 other native men had been found frozen to death. Then, while Don was working on that, he got a note from his nephew reminding him about Neil Stonechild having frozen to death in 1990. Soon, Don was representing multiple people who had cases against the Saskatoon Police Service. On top of Daryl, he represented the family of Neil, the family of Lawrence Wagner, and the family of a 53-year-old man named Lloyd Dustyhorn who had frozen to death after being dropped off on his front porch by police in the middle of winter. The RCMP opened an investigation into the Saskatoon Police Service's use of Starlight Tours against the native residents of the city. Sergeant Ken Lyons was charged with interviewing everyone involved in the case: constables, witnesses, and victims' families. Starting back with the death of Neil Stonechild, Sergeant Lyon interviewed constables Hartwig and Senger. Larry Hartwig insisted that he had not taken Neil into custody on the night of November 24, 1990, but most of his information came from the limited notes he had taken at the time. One of those notes said that they arrived at Snowberry Downs and that Neil was GOA, which stood for Gone on Arrival. Otherwise, he didn't have any other information to offer. Bradley Senger wasn't any more help, offering up equally vague notes from the incident. But if that were true, if they had arrived on the scene and Neil was already gone, why did they stop looking for him? He was already wanted for leaving the community home, and they had gotten 2 calls that he was causing problems in the area. Based on the constable's recollections, they arrived at the apartments, found that Neil had already left, and then just did nothing. The movement entries that the constables made that evening and into the following morning were also suspicious. They indicated they were en route to Snowberry Downs at 11:51 p.m. It was 11:56 p.m. when they ran the name Tracy Lee Horse through the system. That was the name that Jason Roy had given them when he was questioned while Neil was in the back seat of the cruiser. It wasn't until 12:17 p.m. that they reported Neil was GOA at Snowberry Downs and cleared the call. They were immediately dispatched to investigate a suspicious person looking into garages only 1 block away from Snowberry Downs, but it took them 6 minutes to arrive on the scene. People in defense of the constables claimed that 5 minutes would not have been enough time to arrive at the apartment, talk to the residents, take Neil into custody, and then confront Jason, but there was no evidence anywhere that they actually talked to the residents. Neil had fled when the police were called and very likely ran into the police as they entered the property. It's suspected that he was confronted on the street, resisted, and was assaulted by the constables before being cuffed and placed into the cruiser. Then there was more than 20 minutes where the constables' activities were unknown before they logged themselves on the scene of the next call. It's important to note that the drive from Snowberry Downs to the area that Neil was found is exactly 10 minutes. The claim that Jason saw Neil in the back seat of the cruiser is credible because he described injuries on his nose that matched injuries on Neil when his body was discovered. Those injuries were measured and confirmed to match the handcuffs that the Saskatoon Police Service used. Markings on Neil's wrist also matched the size and orientation of the same cuffs. Sergeant Keith Jarvis, who had retired in 1994, was also interviewed about his investigation of Neil Stonechild's death. The biggest question was why he had made notes claiming there were no injuries to Neil's body when the autopsy report noted multiple injuries. Jarvis didn't have an answer for that, and it would eventually be determined that Sergeant Jarvis's investigation into the cause of Neil Stonechild's death was inadequate. Before we reach the exciting conclusion of this episode, I just want to remind you that we're trying to hit 1 million subscribers this year, so before you go, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Even better, tell someone else about the channel so they could subscribe too. Then make sure you both turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also support the channel by checking out our merch at thisismonsters.com. A link is in the description. Your support is appreciated, and be kind to each other. The RCMP also investigated a man named Gary Pratt, who was a name that consistently came up during the original investigation into Neil's death as a person who had issues with the teen. He was quickly interviewed back in 1990, but denied any involvement. He was interviewed again in 2000 while he was serving time for another crime. After an interview and having passed a polygraph, it was determined that he was not responsible for the death of Neil Stonechild. At the end of their investigation, the RCMP determined there was compelling evidence that showed that Neil Stonechild was in the custody of Constables Hartwig and Senger on the evening of November 24, 1990. Despite that, no further action was taken on the case. Constable Dan Hatchin and Constable Munson, on the other hand, were charged with unlawful confinement in Daryl Knight's case. They claimed that they had simply given Daryl a ride, dropping him off where he requested, but the jury found them guilty. They were immediately fired and sentenced to 8 months in prison. The RCMP investigation into the deaths of Lawrence Wegner, Rodney Nastis, and Lloyd Dustyhorn failed to produce any criminal charges and were deemed inconclusive. Though Starlight Tours in Saskatoon have received some scrutiny in the 21st century, they still happen to Native people in other areas of Canada. The first recorded incident was in 1976, and the most recent documented case was of a man named Jeremiah Skunk who was forced to walk for 12 hours in intense heat in Ontario in 2019. Still, comments to posts about Starlight Tours on social media show that they continue happening to this day. Of course, there are people who deny the accounts, but it's not a coincidence that so many people who only ever seem to be Indigenous, continue to come forward with complaints about the practice. There is work being done to eliminate racism in Canada's law enforcement community, as well as cooperation between the local police and Indigenous police programs. At the end of the day, police officers are there to make the community safer. Choosing to put a citizen's life in danger, no matter the reason, is unacceptable for anyone in law enforcement. Not only does it make them exactly what they're supposed to be fighting, but it makes the community grow distrustful of law enforcement and creates a less safe environment for everyone. If you want to learn more about the cases mentioned in this story, I suggest the book Starlight Tours, The Last Lonely Night of Neil Stonechild by Susan Reber and Robert Renaud. It's available wherever you buy books. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases in criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.